The next document is the Peterson Memo, Arlington Institute. So this is the meeting that never happened with me and the CIA director. Very interesting. Look at the date. 3rd of December, 1993. The meeting between me and the sitting CIA director was the 13th of December, 1993. And is that document up? And the CIA director, R. James Woolsey, who, when information about my meeting came out after he had left office, denied it ever happened. Luckily, I could call him in a flat-footed lie. I always tell people in Washington, how do you know these politicians and lawyers are lying? Their lips are moving. If their lips are moving, they're lying. I know it's a very cynical thing to say, but unfortunately very true. But this document, which I'm not going to go all the way through, but some of the information is very, very important. I talked to Woolsey this morning, and he suggested getting together, underline. Project Starlight that's referred to here was the coalition I put together before the Disclosure Project, which no one knew about, where I was trying to get the President Clinton to lead the disclosure on this. And it's a very interesting document, because on the second page it says, remember, the most powerful people in the world will have a deep, compelling interest in our activities and will use everything in italics at their disposal to effect their objectives. Very threatening. And then he suggests that I get an encrypted portable phone because my kitchen doesn't have one. I mean, the whole thing is like such. Now here I am, of course, I'm like 30-some years old. I'm an emergency doctor, and I'm being asked to come up and brief the sitting CIA director because, and if you read this carefully, it states in there, he's made inquiries and no one's telling him anything. This is the sitting director of the CIA. This is the proof the meeting took place, and there is other proof. Now, what the hell is going on that a sitting CIA director doesn't know anything about the most top secret CIA project? Illegal, outrageous, unconstitutional, criminal. And when I found this out, now remember, this is 22 years ago almost, it was a shock to me. Because I was raised like most people. I thought, well, there's a president, there are all these spooks, and there's a chain of command, and it operates. I didn't know about unacknowledged special access projects. I certainly could not have imagined that the man who puts together the presidential daily briefing would be kept secret on stuff that I had collected unbelievable amounts of evidence for the existence of UFOs, extraterrestrial intelligence, etc., and so on. But that was the case. And when I met with this man for nearly 3 hours, it became quite clear to me that it was not a prevarication. I really thought that he was saying that just as a way of blowing me off, or, not blowing me off, but sort of saying, I want to meet with you to find out what you know, but I actually do know. And I'm going to pretend like I don't know. No, this man, and my wife can attest to this, was shaken to his foundation. The cover story for the meeting was a dinner party in the D.C. area, which is typical. The wives were invited as cover. Terrible thing to say, but it's true. So my wife was there. I was there. The CIA director and his wife, who's chief operating officer of the National Academy of Sciences, was there, and my host, John Peterson, and his wife. Interestingly, she didn't know who was coming to dinner until that afternoon. He wouldn't tell her. And then she finds out like 2 hours before we appear, there's this UFO expert and the CIA director and his wife coming for dinner. Can you imagine being that wife? And that was I'm sure that night was an interesting conversation after we all left. But that's how these things are done. The real tragedy of it, though, is that if you have a breakdown in government this severe, those of you who are students of governance, where you can have a CIA director or senior members of the military who are being left out of something very important and which hundreds of billions of dollars per year are going into, then you have no government. So the deep national security state from 1950s until today has devolved into this sub rosa, unacknowledged, not international, transnational entity with representation in the UK, Canada, Australia, Brazil, China, Russia, former Soviet Union, which on this issue work together like this. It is not responsive to the body politic. It is not responsive to the heads of government or even the heads of committees and cabinet level people. There are some cabinet level people, however, who have known. I mentioned a few. There was a CIA director known as George H.W. Bush, and the CIA headquarters is now named after him. He was a member and is a member of MAGIC. But then there are others like Woolsey who wouldn't be told anything. Some presidents have been given a little information, and some have been told nothing. Why? Well, here's how it works. It took me a long time to figure out something very simple. I call this a soul biopsy, because doctors are talking about biopsies, but it's a psychological analysis. So let's say this gentleman is the incoming director of the CIA. The outgoing director of the CIA is me. As incoming director of the CIA, they've taken your life apart, and they know what your values are. If your values are that you would not go along with an illegal, criminal, unconstitutional effort and engage in assassinations that were illegal and other things, they will never tell you about this. And even if you're the president that's incoming, this is what happened to Jimmy Carter. And I know this for a fact. Jimmy Carter got elected, and the outgoing CIA director was, guess who? George H.W. Bush. George H.W. Bush, when he was called in and they had the transition meeting for between November and January when they had the transition and they're standing up the new cabinet, was asked personally, face to face, by Jimmy Carter, and I met with someone who was there, about the UFO issue. And Bush said, I'm not going to tell you, in a very derisive way, about that. Go see if you can get it from the Congressional Research Service. Literally. Brushed him off. And Carter was stunned, because Carter had had a UFO sighting when he was governor of Georgia. I have his report form that he filed officially, signed Jimmy Carter. He ran in 1976 on ending UFO secrecy, actually. With the British government, because I had to explain to him why he never knew anything about this. And it's a very hard thing to sit with someone like a CIA director or someone like this, who's one of the most powerful people in the military and intelligence field in the world, and tell them, you just were not in the loop. And he basically said to me, well, why didn't they tell me? And he was a little hurt and kind of petulant. And I said, sir, I'm going to answer your question with a question. What would you have done if you'd found out there was a transnational entity, unacknowledged, running unconstitutionally in your country and mine, engaging in assassinations, keeping from the planet technologies that would save the earth from environmental destruction and eliminate poverty within a generation? And that they are using these technologies to try to provoke, as agents provocateurs, an interstellar conflict and World War III. And that they were completely off the reservation without any controls from the chief executive or the legitimate governments of the world. And he hopped up and down. He's this little guy with piercing blue. He says, I wouldn't have stood for a bloody minute. I said, well, that's why they didn't tell you. He says, what do you mean? He thought I was being impertinent. I said, because they knew you wouldn't go along with that agenda. Therefore, you're out of the loop. That's how it works. It's that simple. So you basically accumulate people who are enormously evil and who want to see terrible damage done to the planet because at their core, they love war and they love conflict. They do not want peace to break out. As one of them said to me, heaven forbid we should have peace on this planet. Too many people would be out of business. Too many of us would be out of business. Very cynical, but true. The next document is from one of my advisors to Admiral Tom Wilson. And it's about setting up a briefing for him. And I only put this up here because some people have challenged me, did you really have meetings with folks like this? Yes, absolutely. And it was on my birthday in 1995, the first letter was written. I ended up meeting with him in 97 in April. But he helped us in a number of ways prior to that, as did this Admiral Kramer, who set up my meetings at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, the facility to which the crashed ET remains went in 1940s in Dayton, Ohio. And this meeting was another one where I was able to provide to him some very important information prior to the meeting, including a 1991 document which has not been declassified, and I will go to that one next. It's the National Reconnaissance Office document. And that document is basically a security alert. And the reason it's important is not so much for its content or on the next page, which is a warning that a group of UFO buffs were trying to penetrate the perimeter of Area 51, so it's called. Nobody calls it that, really. It's the Nellis Range. But this was generated, and you can see the date, July 1991, and take a note of the distribution list, please. And we're going to get back to that in a moment. But it's a security blue fire, which is a code name, 1991, Commander's Net, Royal Ops, Cosmic Ops. So cosmic clearance, you've heard of this? Not a myth, it's real. Magi, as the majority, as the magic, M-A-J-I-C, ops. And it goes to a whole bunch of them, Nellis Division, all these code numbers, and you get down to some really interesting things. MOC is Military Operating Center, and MOA is a Military Operating Area, and SOG is a Special Operations Team. But you get into Red Flag, Dart East, Dart South, Pahut Mesa, Sally Corridor, Groom Lake, Dreamland, Blackjack Team. Blackjack Control is at the Edwards Complex in California. Roulette Team, Aquatech, Sea Spray, and others. Now, it's not clear to me who gave me this why they blacked out a couple of things. Maybe it was things that they were involved with personally and they didn't want to get fingered. But this secret document went to the Admiral prior to our meeting, and he actually recognized one of these entities. And he made an inquiry, and it was being run by a contractor. We're going to get to this next. And the contractor, one of these corporate contractors, when he called them up, he said, I'm Admiral Tom Wilson. At that time, he was head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I want to be read into this project. Guess what happened? They said, sir, you don't have a need to know. Now, this is the guy who puts together the intelligence briefings for the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States. He was told, you don't have a need to know. And Admiral Wilson said, God damn it, if I don't have a need to know, who does? They said, "Sir, we cannot discuss this with you further." They hung up and blocked his line. Now, this all happened before the stand-up meeting I did where Edgar Mitchell, the sixth man to walk on the moon, and myself and my military advisor and a few other people met with the admiral in a stand-up, what's called a stand-up briefing. I was doing the presenting. That was supposed to be 45 minutes. It went for 2 or 3 hours. He kept control. You know the difference between knowledge of something and access control. You can know about something, but if they're non-responsive to your orders, like they were to this admiral, it doesn't matter if you're a general or the president or a CIA director, because they're basically going to say, "Buzz off. We have more power than you do, and go away." And that's how it operates. That is how it operates. This is naked, raw power. It's how it works. So this next document I want to share, unfortunately, did not come out. It's the Congressman Cox. As you know, he was SEC head secretary for W. Bush. But back when he was a congressman from Orange County, a good friend of mine who knew him set up a briefing between me and the congressman at his offices in Orange County. And he was on several key committees, Armed Services Committee, et cetera, and so on. And he wanted to know about the UFO issue. And I said, "Okay, well, I'll come in and I'll brief you." And he said, "Well, this has never been brought up at a briefing." I said, "No, you wouldn't be, because I briefed members personally of the Senate Intelligence Committee and Foreign Relations Committee and House Government and Oversight Chairman and everyone you can think of personally, face to face. And in every case, they have been completely without access. And when they make an inquiry, they're told no such project exists. It doesn't exist. It's unacknowledged. Unacknowledged. Doesn't exist." And he says, "Well, I would like to know." He says, "Where the heck are these things going on? And who are the corporate entities? And where are the bases?" So that was the genesis of the famous Cox memo, which, became kind of infamous because I wrote it to him, and I basically did a subject of a brief summary of the people who I briefed who don't know, and a course of action that he needs to take. Unfortunately, that document didn't come out. It got scrambled by the electronic gremlins in the computer, unless he's fixed it. No, he hasn't. So basically, I describe who is not able to do this, but where the places are. And that was the genesis of this, which is the facilities list. And I want to go through this very quickly of where the key facilities are. Now, keep in mind, these are all run by a hybridized entity. It's part government, unacknowledged special access project, compartmented, deep black, transnational security state, and 3/4 corporate. The action is in the corporate sector. But at each of these bases, there are contractors who run the operations. Do you understand how this works? In other words, the government doesn't do that much. The government does WFO, work for others. So they issue contracts. So you'll have Bechtel Corporation, or you'll have Lockheed Martin, or you'll have whatever. But the key facilities I want to go through, and there are others. This is a list that I updated it for the president in 2009. A very chief one is Edwards Air Force Base, and there's a whole constellation there. Haystack Butte, China Lakes, George Air Force Base, the retired Norton Air Force Base, Tabletop Mountain Observatory, which is run ostensibly by NASA, and Blackjack Control. So I had a source at Blackjack Control associated with the Edwards-related facilities, but the Blackjack team you saw on that list was Nellis. So there's Blackjack Control and Blackjack Team. And then there are aerospace facilities, and these are all DUMBs, Deep Underground Military Bases, or UGBs for short, underground bases. Northrop, the Ant Hill Tejon Ranch. McDonnell Douglas, the Llano Plant. Lockheed Martin, Hellendale. Then Phillips Labs, and the North Edwards facility. And I will add that since then, a newer facility called the Cube, which is up past Lancaster, Palmdale, up in the high desert outside of in the Edwards Range and classified airspace is a Lockheed Martin Skunk Works facility where the state-of-the-art R&D is going on. Keep in mind that Lockheed and Northrop have multiple generations since 1954 of what you would call a UFO, man-made UFO, that are, as the head of the Lockheed Skunk Works said to several people on my team, including Jan Harzan, the new head of MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network. He's an IBM executive that's retired. I've been friends with him since the 20s. I mean, the 20s, since the 90s. He is a man who is of great integrity, and he actually was at the meeting along with several other of my friends when Ben Rich, the head of the Lockheed Skunk Works, a super secret, it's where the U-2 spy plane in that movie came from, said, we can take E.T. home. We already have the technologies to take E.T. home, and ended his presentation with a slideshow of a black disc going out into space. Sounds fantastic? No, it's not. This is the head of the Lockheed Skunk Works. So we're flying around on jets, which are basically a vacuum tube that's pressurized with a bomb, a pre-positioned bomb called explosive jet fuel A that you're flying on, thousands of gallons of, when we have had these things since the 50s. How ridiculous. We're sending our astronauts up on rockets that blow up and kill them like the shuttle astronauts when we've had these things since the 50s. This is criminal. It's outrageous. But that's the way it is. So this is how it's developed. And then I just wanted to let you know that this new facility, the Cube, is, I have an engineer that I've met with who works in that facility. And they work on not just the propulsion systems, but also the electronic warfare systems and the bio-nanotechnology, which we'll get to after our break. And those are the things that the UFO retail world of books and movies and conferences would call aliens. These are man-made. They have integrated circuits in their brains, and they walk around. They're little gray or reptilian or creepy-looking things. These are man-made, 100%. And I know the men working on that, but the Cube is associated. That's one facility associated with those. Another facility is Dulce, another one is Pine Gap. So the other, of course, you've all heard Nellis Complex, it's Area 51. More specifically, it's S4, S9, and S12. Those are compartmented areas. You have to have a password and biometrics to get into them. Pahut Mesa and Area 19 and Groom Lake. These are all things that have been provided to our government officials. In New Mexico, you have the Los Alamos National Laboratory. It has an underground connector, that goes to the Dulce complex, which most people don't think can really exist because you go to Dulce, there's nothing there. Remember this simple fact. Nothing critical is above the surface of the ground. It's either in space or it's underground. Everything, including White House facilities and Pentagon. Everything critical is underground. The Kirkland Air Force Base has the Sandia National Laboratories and the Defense Nuclear Agency, Phillips Labs again, Manzano Mountain Weapons Storage Facility and underground complex that connects, Coyote Mountain Test Site, north end of Manzano, the White Sands Complex, and again, the Dulce Complex. So Kirkland Air Force Base, and that's outside, of course, Albuquerque. I've been there. In Arizona, a key facility is Fort Huachuca. It's a underground base, most of it, that's critical. It's Army Intelligence Headquarters. There is a storage facility where a man, as of the 1970s, who was on my team, worked in it, and at that time they had 9 extraterrestrial spacecraft that had been down using these electromagnetic pulse scalar weapons, and a whole lot of different ET species that were frozen there. And that's at Fort Huachuca, ironically near Tombstone. The other ones that I just want to mention, Cheyenne Mountain, which is under the mountain in Colorado Springs, has a dedicated area for just the Deep Space Network tracking of interstellars that are in our solar system. And one of my military advisors, a man who's been in many of these unacknowledged special access projects, actually was in that facility and got to see this Console 50 where they had tracked, and he said that they had tracked an object at that time that was in our solar system that was 26 miles in diameter, an artificial ET object, moving, as he put it, under its own steam. He's a Navy guy. I said, I don't think it's working with steam, but yeah, you're right. Another critical facility is the Lawrence Livermore Labs, the Pine Gap underground facility in Australia. I have a picture, actually, of the above ground facility there that a man who'd worked there sent to me. The Redstone Arsenal underground complex in Alabama, that also has an association with the Marshall Space Flight Center. And in Utah, one of the most critical, and this is the most critical one that's new, is the Dugway Proving Grounds outside of Provo. And this is classified airspace above and no access by ground. Above ground, you don't see much, and everything is underground. Richard Foch, this Naval Research Labs official, was out there with some Generation 5 or 6 or whatever night scopes doing an operation, and he looked out and he saw these objects coming out from underground that then zipped over, and that were these massive disc and triangular shape anti-gravity objects that were ours, and some were just sitting out there watching him. And that's outside of Provo, out in the desert. So that is a very key, and that one is mostly manned by folks who are part of the Mormon corporate empire, which, if I were to rank who has what kind of say-so over policy on this, that would rank certainly ahead of the president or Congress. I won't comment further than that. This is not to make an aspersion to rank and file Mormons. It's just this is how that operation works. The agencies in the U.S. government are associated with this. The AFOSI, Air Force Office of Special Investigation, of course, compartmented operations at CIA, the Defense Advanced Research Project Administration, the Defense Intelligence Agency. Now, notwithstanding, I briefed the general who was head of it. He wasn't given any information, but we have Disclosure Project witnesses who are DIA assigned contractors who were very involved in ET and UFO technology issues. Certain compartmented operations at the FBI being tightly held. And every military intelligence division, Army, Air Force, Navy, have compartmented, unacknowledged operations that feed into this magic committee. The National Reconnaissance Office, the National Security Agency, again, a very compartmented operation, certainly nothing that Edward Snowden had access to my knowledge, although it's been asked, and the various space commands. Private corporate entities include BDM Corporation. Bechtel Corporation does most of the underground base construction. I know that the tunnel being built from Los Alamos over to Dulce. For years, people heard, you look and Google this, the Taos, T-A-O-S, hum. A lot of New Agers thought it was like Gaia singing or something. I'm going, no. There's a massive nuclear-powered tunneling device that was going from Los Alamos over to Dulce, and as it was going, it goes through bedrock and glassifies it into this massive tunnel that then anti-gravity electromagnetic vehicles transport people carriers underneath the ground. And as it was going through that bedrock, it caused this vibration. But that was being operated by Bechtel, and I was at a meeting with Stephen Bechtel once, and they are very key. And Booz Allen Hamilton, of course, is who Snowden worked for, but they're a key contractor. They do have a compartmented operation dealing with this. Boeing Aerospace, EG&G, very key facility for creating electronics and also the state-of-the-art nanotechnology implants that are put into abduction victims, people that think they had contact with ETs, but they're actually being abducted by military and corporate folks. E-Systems, which is now a division of Raytheon. Lockheed Martin, I've mentioned. McDonnell Douglas is now part of Boeing. MITRE Corporation, M-I-T-R-E, very key in terms of anti-gravity and high-tech. It's here in the D.C. area and other places. Northrop Grumman. I mentioned Phillips Labs before. Rockwell International, SAIC, and this is one of the crown jewels. SAIC is a company, Science Applications International Corporation. Admiral Bobby Ray Inman has for years been a member of this magic committee, along with Dick Cheney and Papa Bush. But the SAIC, he had been National Security Agency head. He moved from National Security head over to the board of SAIC. And in a little side story, interestingly, when I asked Senator Barry Goldwater when I was at his home some years ago, and he'd run for president in '64, but he always had an interest in this, but had never been told anything. And we started comparing notes of who we knew, and he said, how can I help you? I said, well, if you could reach out to some of these people on this Magic committee, it'd be great. And so, we named some names. He didn't know the ones I mentioned. And then I said, well, Admiral Bobby Ray Inman. He says, oh, Bobby Ray, we've been friends for years. I said, well, get hold of him. Give him a jingle, would you? So he did. Biggest mistake of his life. He got hold of me. He says, I can't make any more phone calls like that for you. He tore me apart. He tore me a new one. But Admiral Inman, definitely a Magic member, as are other chief people on the SAIC. But it's compartmentalized. So, most people work on conventional things there. TRW, Village Supercomputing, Wackenhut, security, does a lot of security for Magic. And then there are others as well. Some of these are ones most people have never heard of. A lot of these corporations, they're huge and they have enormous reach. And I think that what you have to understand is that there is certainly not limited to that list, but it feeds into a system. And most people don't even understand how it works. And I always tell people, go back and look at the interview of Denise McKenzie. Worked for SAIC. She got a job there as a sort of clerical administrative person. She was in an office. It's kind of like the mafia. You know how the mafia will have like a pizza parlor or some little shop, and they'll come in and, that's the storefront, but it's actually laundering money and they're doing their drugs and pimps through the back door. That's how this works. So she was in this office at SAIC, and it was an office, it was running multi-million-dollar contracts for the U.S. government. And she said, what is this? There's nothing going on here. And she went to this file cabinet, and there were just all these dummied-up reports that would go back to Capitol Hill to justify the money. And when she started asking about it, they said, don't ask about this. And what she basically was told, this office receives the money. We generate false reports back to the president and to Congress. That money then passes out of this office to a black project dealing with UFOs.